Hey, Melody. Thank you so much. Again, I'm Amy Walter. I'm the senior editor at the Cook Political Report. Going, like many of you, on a little sleep. So, trying to wrap my head around getting this transition correctly. But I'm really excited for this next panel that I get to moderate. Just to paraphrase the late Governor Mario Cuomo, candidates are able to campaign in poetry, but they have to govern in prose. And I think no one understands that reality better than the four women who I'm going to talk to in the next moment about making that transition from being a candidate, even if that candidate happens to be the sitting president of the United States, to then coming in post November and transitioning in that time to taking office in January and putting forward an agenda that you talked about nonstop on the campaign trail. All of the folks I'm speaking with have also had experience coming in at times of crises, political or economic. So I think they're going to have great insights into what the 2021 process may look like. So I'm going to introduce them right now. I'm going to start here with Alexis Herman, who served as Secretary of Labor under President Clinton. She was also chair, CEO of the 92 DNC and deputy director of then President-elect Clinton's transition team. Karen Hughes, counselor to President George W. Bush. She also served as his director of communications as Texas governor and on his 2000 campaign. Valerie Jarrett, senior advisor to President Obama, the director of White House Office of Public Engagement and Intergovernmental Affairs, and Margaret, who was the Secretary of Education under George W. Bush, and she also worked for the Texas governor in his administration as a senior advisor. Thank you all for being here. And Valerie, I'm going to start with you because not only do you share with your panelists this unique experience of going from campaign to governing, but you have done it for a candidate uh, going into a first term, and then a president who served, obviously, who won and then went on to serve a second term. So, can you help folks understand what that looks like being the candidate and then being the incumbent and how you approach both of those?
Sure, thank you. And hello, everyone. I'm delighted to be here. So I think it's absolutely right to say you campaign in poetry. It's aspirational, particularly when you are going in for your first term. You set forth in a robust agenda of all of the things that you want to do for the country. You contrast yourself with your predecessor, and then suddenly, you're the dog that catches the bus, and you have to move swiftly to more concrete strategic plans for how you want to get done everything you said you wanted to get done, and deal with all of the income. I think that I was one of the co-chairs of President Obama's transition in the first term, together with John Podesta and Pete Rouse. And we started about in July. President Obama did his due diligence by speaking to former Democratic chiefs of staff to get a sense of how they organized going in. And then we really began our work in earnest, working with the policy folks from the campaign and starting to line up who we thought would be most effective to do the policy work once he was in office. And so it was a combination of thinking through how you're going to implement the strategies that you articulated during the campaign, the priorities that you've articulated, finding the right people. And we spent a lot of time interviewing candidates, vetting candidates. President Obama made it very clear that we were only going to be as good as our weakest link, and so he wanted to make sure we assembled a team that not only shared his values and his integrity, but also his priorities, and then kind of hit the ground running. One point I will make that doesn't get as much attention as I think it deserves is how incredibly helpful President Bush and his entire team were to us during the transition. He made it very clear he wanted a smooth transition of power, even though we had disagreed on just about every possible policy you could think of. They were a treasure trove of information that proved invaluable, and they couldn't have been more open and candid and forthcoming with us to make sure that we were equipped with the benefit of their experience so that we could hit the ground running as soon as and as easily as possible. Going into a second term is different. You now do not have the initial challenge of the team that may have worked together in the campaign, new people coming in. President Obama said often in the beginning he had the best players on the field. By the end of the second term, he felt he had the best team, and that's very different. Many members of our cabinet stayed for the second term, but President Obama did go through this disciplined process, going actually every 2 years of saying, okay, here's where we are, here are our priorities, what's must do, what's would be great to do, what is it nice to do, so that it would help frame our energies and time management as we went into each successive 2 year period. I think the final thing I would say about the first transition is, of course, there are those unexpected. We were not, nobody was expecting for us to go through what happened in September of 2008 when Lehman Brothers went into bankruptcy and the ensuing crash of the banks teetering on collapse, the automobile industry going into bankruptcy, millions of people losing their jobs and their homes. And that's where the challenge comes. How do you push forward your affirmative agenda while you're dealing with the cards that you inherit? But I will say that the continuity of going from a Republican administration to a Democratic one was made much easier by having a very helpful and supportive predecessor. And then going to the second term, once you win, that's in a sense an affirmation of what you did in your first term, which makes you realize two things. You must be on the right track in terms of how the country views your accomplishments. But secondly, how quickly 4 years goes, and that it's a finite period of time, and it's kind of a rush to the finish beginning on day one of that second term.
Right. Really good points. And in fact, I'm going to go to one of your predecessor, somebody worked for your predecessor, Karen Hughes, and you also have the rare experience of a very compressed transition time. Bush v. Gore happened December, I think it was December 12th of 2000. Now you have to go from December, you now have a month before you're inaugurated. And I want you to talk a little bit about how you balance you personally and then folks who were working with the Texas Governor Bush in that period in between when you were still doing the legal work on the legal case, you were essentially still a candidate. You were not yet president elect, and then how you made that transition work.
Well, Amy, as you can imagine, it was just an excruciating time. I mean, the only thing that gets you through something as intense as a presidential campaign, in the last couple of months, every day you tell yourself, well, in 2 months it's over. And then when you come to election day, you stumble across, and of course it wasn't over. And so I felt like I'd run a marathon, and somebody told me, keep running and we'll let you know when you can stop. And so it was personally a very chaotic time. For example, if we were going to move to Washington, I needed to sell my house. I wasn't wealthy. I couldn't afford to have two houses. And so things like that, and I couldn't put my house on the market because I was afraid the reporters would take that as being, presumptuous that we had won. And so it was a very difficult time. We had several things, though, that really benefited us. One is that President Bush, when he first set out to campaign for president, actually tasked the chief of staff in the governor's office at the time, Clay Johnson. He said, "I want you to come up with a plan for what I do when I win." And that was in June of 1999, 16 months before the election. So Clay Johnson had been quietly working on transition planning all that time. And at some point in the fall, had given me a very comprehensive set of information about the communications functions of the White House and how they're set up and how they're organized. President Bush had actually talked to me the day of the third debate. I would have thought there would have been other things on his mind, but the day of the third debate, we were on a long walk around the lake at the home where we were staying in Missouri, and he started talking to me out loud about how he was thinking about structuring the White House staff. And so we had some preparation. The Florida, however, during the recount, it was so intense, as you said, with all the we were on phones with the lawyers. I was on the phone with James Baker and Margaret Tutwiler in Florida every day. I was in Austin with the president. And so there really wasn't much time during Florida itself to be thinking about the transition to the White House. And so that happened all very quickly when the election was decided on December 12th. We immediately made plans to go to Washington. We did go to Washington, met with President Clinton, met with President Bush, met with President Clinton and Vice President Gore. We tried to meet with some of our counterparts. The transition team had the goal of having the senior staff appointed by December 15th, and so we already had a pretty good idea of who the senior staff was going to be. And by the way, one of the things that President Bush did, I think, very effectively was blended a team of people from Texas who knew him well with a team of experienced people who knew Washington well. And so Andy Card was our chief of staff, Nick Callio, our legislative director. Vice President Cheney obviously had served as chief of staff and Secretary of Defense, and knew Washington well. And so he really blended those experiences. And so those of us who I remember President Bush, when he gave me my job description, I said, "What do you mean by this counselor to the president?" And he said, "I want you to go to every meeting where a major decision is being made. I want you to tell the people in the room how I will approach that decision, and then I want you to tell me what you really think." And so I was going to a dizzying blur of meetings about things about which I often knew very little. But we had people in around the table with our senior staff who also knew a great deal about Washington and about the policy issues.
Right. Alexis, Herman, I want to come to you. You obviously involved in the 92 campaign on the political side. You move over to do the transition. And you're one of the people here on this panel who is working for a candidate who defeated a sitting incumbent. So this was going and sitting down with the folks who you beat their guy, right? So how was that? What is that experience like sitting down with the people? This may happen this year where you come into an office where the sitting staff they're not leaving because their guy's been turned out, they're leaving because, well, you beat him.
It's interesting you posed the question that way, Amy, and thank you, and hello to my fellow panelists, all of whom I've had the good fortune to work with in some capacity over the years. I'll tell you what it's like. For me personally, I will never forget the day, and Karen used the term transition planning, which is something you don't really talk much about. That's that secret moment when you're engaged with the transition process and you can't talk about it, and no one knows that you're in this tiny office preparing for that eventuality if the president wins, and then you talk formally about transition. So for me, I was a part of that small office with transition planning that eventually led to the transition process. And I did accompany that day to the White House Warren Christopher, who was the head of transition, and Vernon Jordan, and the meeting with Andy Card. You never know how that's going to feel, right? But I have to give Andy a lot of credit, and I remember that day very well. He was very professional. He was very welcoming. We were sitting there in the Roosevelt room, and you have your list of the critical issues that you want to make sure you understand what the handoff process is going to be about. So for us, in our transition process, we were very clear about the critical issues in the key agencies that we wanted to engage the White House on, and not just the larger, quote, White House agenda. So for us, it turned, quite frankly, into a real business meeting. It was a real, quote, business session that was very respectful. But honestly, I had a lot of trepidation going into it because we just really weren't sure about the receptivity and the degree of cooperation that we would receive. I'd had a little insight because I was, of course, in the Carter administration as counsel to the Secretary of Labor and Director of the Women's Bureau. So I had experienced that transition on the other end, but really from an agency perspective in a very limited role. But my Republican counterpart, and I'll never forget, it was Connie Newman at the time, who was President Bush's leader of the OPM. And she was the liaison at the Labor Department during the Carter years. And so Connie, who is a dear friend to this day, was my contact. So I expected, quite frankly, that transition to mirror what I had experienced many years before as a part of the Ford Carter transition. And I was not disappointed. And I know that with other administrations, there have been challenges. But I have to say that handoff that day in the Roosevelt Room for us was respectful, disciplined. We did not go into the agencies not knowing who each of our contacts would be, and that's very important. And there was a White House team that made it very clear to us that they would be available to us uh, for whatever we needed, and we had to take advantage of that offer. So for me, respect and cooperation and clear lines of communication are what you really need as you engage in that process, and get rid of all of the preconceived notions and ideas and the partisan moments that often can come into play when you've just come off of a very political environment to win an election.
Yeah. Boy, I hope there are certain people listening very closely. That's wonderful. Thank you. Margaret Spellings, I want to talk to you about sort of the process of this. And, again, you've been on a campaign. You and Karen Hughes, you both worked for the governor, so you know him personally a little bit better than, sort of a traditional campaign staffer who maybe never met this candidate before, it never worked for them. But how do you ensure that, and Valerie touched on this, how do you ensure that all these promises that you make on the campaign trail, all these commitments you make on the campaign trail, are able to translate into policy, especially in those first chaotic 100 days as you're still trying to figure out, where the bathrooms are, to know that you're staying sort of focused on keeping what you talked about on the campaign moving forward into governing?
Thank you, Amy. It's terrific to be with everybody, these fantastic women leaders. I think it's a testament to both of our bosses that we were all involved with them. As we all know, things go better when you have women involved. So anyway, it's great to be here. Yes, I think you have to know what you're about, and you have to have a game plan and focus and priorities. And in President Bush's case, we knew in that secret moment that Alexis talked about that education was something that obviously had great comfort for him. I mean, he didn't need a lot of tutoring or talking points, had a great record in Texas, real nexus between what one does at state policy and the understanding there and what we were trying to achieve in Washington, something that in the aftermath of a contentious election really is something that Americans can gather around. There's great consensus around education. That certainly was true in the 8 years of the Bush administration, working with people like Senator Ted Kennedy and Congressman George Miller, and continued into the Obama administration. I was, in fact, on a panel yesterday with Arnie Duncan, my good friend. And so we had, we leaned into those issues that I think all Americans, nod their heads about. Now, in terms of just managing that, I really want to emphasize Karen's point about having people around you as president who know you well, who know what you're about, as well as people who know Washington well. And I remember, having that feeling of, gosh, I don't know a heck of a lot about what they're talking about, but I do know a heck of a lot about George W. Bush. And I know how he thinks about things. I know how he thinks about priorities and the like. And so I think being, to Alexis's point, humble in the opportunity, understanding the gravitas of a situation, the soberness of being at the White House, and the awesomeness of your charge, and really, there's plenty of work for everybody, figuring out how to create a symphony of players with the expertise that can get something done. In our case, the first priority, as was said by Barbara Perry, was No Child Left Behind, and all of the things that President Bush did on week one in office to build those bridges, build those relationships, and get things done. I do have one quick story about that. When he first met with Senator Kennedy in the Oval Office, literally the second day of the administration, probably. And I remember him saying, Karen, you were probably in the room at the time. So the press is going to come in here and they're going to ask us about school choice and vouchers. And here's what I, President Bush, am going to say about that. I'm going to say we had a great conversation, that we're off to a great start, and not take the bait, essentially. And of course, Senator Kennedy returned the favor, and I think it was the first of many goodwill gestures that they both showed to each other along the way, and netted out in a really important piece of landmark legislation and ultimately mental health parity, and on and on.
Well, Margaret, that's interesting. My question about that too is obviously this was a key issue on the campaign trail, but did the fact that the election was so contentious and that it ended the way it ended push the idea of having a bipartisan deal with Senator Kennedy to the very top? And it might have been in there at some point, but it might have been number 3 or 4.
Absolutely. And you'll recall during the transition when then President-elect Bush invited Washington leaders to the governor's mansion in Texas, including Congressman George Miller, who had watched and admired the work that we were doing in Texas to close the achievement gap, to measure and disaggregate data and invest resources and whatnot. And so absolutely, timing is everything in life, and certainly in politics and policy, that we had this need for something that could be common cause across the aisle, and a cast of characters and some players. And frankly, we were taking Republicans where they had never gone before, and maybe some were uncomfortable about going, the Judd Greggs of the world, the people who were, heretofore abolish the Department of Education type Republicans, but they were following their leader in important ways, and I think that is how we started the conversation.
Alexis, I want to go back to something you said about being in this tiny little office and you can't talk to anybody and you're sort of holed up there for a while. Can you sort of demystify this process for the rest of us about like what this actually looks like? And everybody here on this panel has made clear that this kind of planning starts over the summer of an election year. So
Yes.
you're in a windowless office for 6 months. Is that what it looks like?
Well, I ran, as you indicated, the 92 convention. I was CEO of that. And I went immediately, that was July of 1992. I went immediately from the convention operation, shutting it down, to being a part of this small office called transition planning. And I think every president is different in terms of how they approach it. But the first rule for us, and there were 5 of us in this office, was that we could have no conversations with anyone, especially Bill and Hillary Clinton, because they just didn't want to, quote, jinx the process. I mean, that was like drilled into our heads. You can't talk about it. You can't talk about it. And so I was like, well, how do you do the work if you can't get, they said, don't worry, you'll get the input, but you can't talk about it. So the first thing you do is you get this small team and you get the ground rules straight. And that was ours. You couldn't talk to anyone. And I'm in Little Rock along with this huge campaign operation with Carvel and all the boys, right? And it's like, well, why do I say I'm here? And they gave me some script about labor. I can't even remember what it was now. And I did a little of that in terms of labor unions. And, I'd been at the Labor Department before, but I could never talk about transition planning. And so what happens, to be very specific, you have sort of 3 lanes in transition planning. There's the White House lane, where you're looking at the White House operation, that first 100 days of how you launch the presidency, and the cabinet. The second lane is that national security lane, and you have to have someone in transition planning that already has a national security clearance so that they can really be doing the very quiet and delicate work of all of the national security issues with a national security clearance that you actually can get ahead of time from the agency, from the State Department, because you do have to reveal, who's working on what. And then the third lane, and this is how we were charged, was then, quote, everything else. It was called the agency liaison. That was my portfolio. I was responsible for organizing all of the issues, the critical issues in all of the agencies that you would, quote, inherit as the incoming administration, but also you had to take into account the plan that was going on in what I call Lane One, the president's agenda, the White House agenda, those first 100 days, and you had to know what agencies would impact the execution of the president's agenda. So in my case, of course, Bill Clinton's economic plan was going to be the first thing, on the table, which was a heavy lift for Treasury, a heavy lift for the Economic Council. So getting very clear about the Treasury operations, the Department of Commerce operation, all of those agencies that especially impacted that first 100 days would be at the top of my list. So in that transition planning process, you are laying out the priorities, you get these lanes straight, and then you tentatively select a key leadership team that will go into each of these areas should the president win. Now that's very painful. The other hat I wore, I was co-chair for Senator Kerry's transition operation. I have to say it was one of the most effective operations that I'd ever been a part of, but of course he didn't get elected. And so, but you have all of these people that you're quietly reaching out to. Some of them you can't tell them what their role is going to be. You simply have to say to them, I need you to be on standby should the president win. So you have a team in waiting, if you will, that you have to be ready to deploy the very next day should the president win the election. Actually, at midnight that night, that's how we were set up. So it's a quiet operation, but it's strategic. It's a lot of planning. It's aligning that first 100 days of the president's agenda, and it's making sure you have a handle on the very critical issues that the previous administration may have been dealing with that you're going to inherit on day one, and there can't be time to think about what are you going to do. You have to have made some preliminary decisions about how we operate. I was focused on this entire program, but I was particularly interested when the earlier panel, they said Hillary Clinton actually raised in the briefing with the Obama administration what happens because they were inheriting, obviously, an environment that was very different from ours if there's a bombing at the inauguration. So you have to really be thoughtful about what you're inheriting. And it's not all about you and what you want to execute, but also what's on the current administration's plate. So I could go on, but that's a little bit in terms of the secretness that goes on in transition planning.
Thank you for drawing the curtain back for us. I'm going to start by asking this to Valerie, Jarrett, but anybody else can feel free to jump in as well. These are some questions that we had gotten from registrants to this conference, and a number of them reference career government staff. Like, how do you work with them? One question was about the most useful types of information that were shared with you by career staff, and another one was about the recommendations you can give to career staff about how to prepare for a transition, especially if what we're doing is transitioning from one party in power to the next.
Well, again, I think that depends on the cooperation you get from your predecessor. As I mentioned, President Bush made it clear to everyone government-wide that he expected full cooperation. And so that made our job a lot easier. We did have, I think as Karen mentioned earlier, we had both people who knew Washington, had been in the government before, having John Podesta as one of the co-chairs of the transition was enormously helpful. Pete Rouse was really helpful as well. I was the newcomer to Washington, but I knew the Obamas. And so I think it was really important that we signaled to the career teams all over, the professionals, that we valued their input, that we weren't just going to come in with this top-down set of priorities without listening to their wise counsel, and to try to get the ball running by showing them the respect that they deserve. Many of them, particularly in agencies like the national security agencies, intelligence agencies, Justice Department, been around for a long time, and we deferred a lot to their professional judgment, not just during the transition, but throughout our time in office. And so it was important to hit the ground running well with them. Again, made much easier by cooperation from President Bush. The final point I would make is that as we populated the agencies, many of us who were political appointees, myself included, spent a lot of time, and this is post-inauguration, going to the agencies and meeting with the career team to try to demystify who we were. There's always this sense of like, oh, here they come, and they think they know everything, and we wanted to really lift them up by having senior people from the White House get outside of the White House and travel around to the agencies. And that was a priority in all 8 years. And I enjoyed it. I learned a lot from those career folks.
I'll jump in there. I think, our career public servants are a treasure. And, our culture carriers within agencies and departments, incredibly knowledgeable and just a tremendous asset to a president and to our citizens. You need to develop those relationships on day one, especially in places like the OMB, where they're going to help you develop the president's budget and detail around things like the State of the Union that are quickly going to be developed and delivered. And so my own experience was they were valuable. We listened to them, and I think to overlook or to suggest that they're part of a deep state or some such is really disrespectful and tragic, because they really are such a treasure to our citizens and to any administration.
Margaret, a couple of things. One is at the White House. When we first went to the White House, I realized that there's such a source of institutional knowledge. And so I remember one of the things, the first couple of weeks, I was planning some event and I was going to do it in the Rose Garden. And somebody said to me, "Oh, you can't do that. We only use the Rose Garden for good news." And so just the little things like that about what the different rooms are used for and what is the tradition and what is not. Where I found that the career, because our transition was so truncated, we did not really have much interaction with our predecessors at the White House the first time when we came in. Where I really found the career staff to be absolutely invaluable to me was when I went to the State Department in the second term, when I became Undersecretary for Public Diplomacy and Public Affairs. And public diplomacy was sort of at the time a stepchild at the State Department. You may remember that the former U.S. Information Agency had been merged into the State Department, and there were still a lot of hard feelings when I got there. They were still calling the merger the murder of USIA, and so I wanted to send a signal that the public diplomacy was important and was valued. And so one of the first things I did was have my deputy, Dina Powell, who'd come from the White House Personnel Office. I said, "I want you to recruit some of the best Foreign Service officers at the State Department, because I want other people at the State Department to look and say, Dan Smith is going to public diplomacy," because I wanted to send the signal that this was important and that we were going to have the very best people. And Dan Smith became my chief of staff, and Gretchen Welch and others who were fabulous career public servants and who taught me so much every day that I was at the State Department. And I agree wholeheartedly with Margaret. They are absolutely a treasure and were completely invaluable to my ability to do a job on behalf of the country.
I'm going to throw out the sort of elephant in the room, so to speak, about thinking about the potential transition in 2021 from if former Vice President Joe Biden were to win. We know that this president has had a lot of rhetoric around accusations that the election will be rigged, that he would leave as long as the election is fair. I'd just like for all of you to sort of weigh in on a couple of questions. One, your assumption that after 200 plus years of peaceful transitions, if you still believe that that is going to be the case this time around. And the second is, even if we assume that this is going to go smoothly, if Biden were to win and we have inauguration day and a new president is sworn into office, that the transition, as you are talking about, which just all sounds lovely and people are helpful and work together and use the time in between election day and the inaugural to learn stuff from each other, whether you think that's going to be the case this time around. Who wants to start with that one?
Well, I'll just say I hope so. And I think we have to remember that we've had difficult elections before in our history. I went back in preparation for this and reread President Bush's speech the night that he became president on December 12th. Well, the night that it became clear that he had won the election on December 12th when the Supreme Court stopped the recount in Florida. And I read that speech, and I think that's exactly the speech that we need to hear. And one of the things that he talked about were the lessons of history. He talked about another difficult election in 1800 when there was a tie in the Electoral College, and it went to the House. And I think it took 6 days and 36 votes or something to be resolved. And Thomas Jefferson became the president. And that was the first transfer of the presidency in our young democracy's history from one party to another. And President Jefferson wrote shortly thereafter, he talked about the steady character of our countrymen is a rock to which we can safely moor. And President Bush, the night that he was determined to have won the election, referred to that and talked about the steady character of the American people and urged respect for each other and urged a generosity of spirit and respect for our differences. And he went out of his way to say, I'm not the president of one party, I'm the president of one country. And whether you voted for me or not, I will seek to earn your support and to serve your best interests. He was very gracious to Vice President Gore and said he knew they'd both gone through the same thing and that he couldn't imagine how difficult the moment must be for him. And he thanked his supporters, both his own supporters and Vice President Gore's supporters. And so I think that's what we need to hear. I certainly hope that we will hear it this time. And I think there have been difficult and divisive elections before in our history. And I hope that gives us some comfort as we look back and realize that our country has done this before many times.
And I would add, Amy, I would add to what Karen has just said. I guess in the words of the great prophet, I remain a prisoner of hope. The way Karen has just said this. And, she made me remember how I felt listening to President Bush that day. I was literally still in my office trying to quickly pack up my books and my desk and to get out of that moment on Capitol Hill. And I don't remember who, quite frankly, that agency liaison was from the Bush transition who was there. But I was there with tears in my eyes. And I remember this person looked at me and said, I know this is a painful moment for you personally. And I said, yeah, it is. But, we have a new president. And that spirit which we must all move forward. I don't know what this new moment is going to be like. I honestly don't. We talked about those terrific career civil servants. I think if this election is elongated, that we're going to be very dependent on their steadiness and the continuity of their leadership. Because Social Security checks still have to go out and unemployment benefits have to still be taken care of. I mean, the business of government is about the lives of everyday people. So I hope that we will show respect if we are in a moment of crises, and I hope not bitterness, but I hope we will remember these career servants that we've just talked about, because much will be on their shoulders during that time.
Valerie, you want
Amy,
to weigh in?
I think what I would add is this. Well, first of all, to state the obvious, President Trump is no President Bush. And yes, it's a contentious campaign, but it's been a contentious 4 years. I do take hope from Vice President Biden's comments a couple of weeks ago, where he said, "I'm running as a Democrat, but if I win, I'll govern as the American president and represent the whole country." I don't feel that President Trump has done that in this last 4 years, which is deeply troubling. And I am hopeful by nature. I still believe in hope and change, but I also recognize how hard it is to be hopeful. And my counsel to Johannes Abrahams, who was my former chief of staff the last term in the White House, and I met him when he was a field organizer, having just graduated from Yale back in 2007, field organizer in Iowa. So I've known him a long time, and I'm so proud that Vice President Biden has given him this responsibility of managing his transition. But what I said to him is, look, hope for the best, but you better plan for the worst. And I think there's going to be a lot more responsibility on Vice President Biden's transition team to reach out to those career folks, because I honestly don't think that they're going to get a lot of cooperation from the most senior people. And certainly not from the president. I'd like to hope that there are other folks who work in the White House or who are political appointees who we could appeal to their better angels going into this transition. I was heartened by the comments that we saw from many of the Republicans on the Hill, who doubled down to reinforce there will be a smooth transition of power. But I am actually not confident, and I'm worried, deeply and profoundly worried, that if the election goes much beyond November 3rd, which I think we should realistically expect it might, with so many people voting absentee for their own safety, that this notion that that somehow is an illegitimate way, when we've been doing it in the military since the Civil War and many of our other states for a very long time, and that isn't until now that it's really been questioned in terms of its legitimacy. I worry that that is ginning up a lot of anger among the American people. And so I think the challenge for whoever is elected is not just to ensure that government itself is functioning well going into the next term, but that the polarization of our country begins to heal. And I think that is going to be a real challenge no matter who is elected.
Just quickly to add kind of a practical point is, the beat goes on. I mean, January 20th is going to come, and as Alexis says, the business of government must go on. If there's a transition, executive orders that had been issued fairly recently can be revoked. If President Trump is reelected, there will be a changing of the guard. There will be personnel changes. And so just the practical reality of making the thing go, I hope, will cause people to rise to the occasion and get over the politics and get on with it one way or the other. And, we've all been privileged to serve in ways that for two people who are respectful of the role they played. And certainly signal that to the people around them. And I hope and pray that will be the case this go around.
Well, that leads, we have just a couple minutes left, and it leads to this question that we had from one of the audience about the recommendation that you could give to career leadership to prepare for whatever moment may be coming for them. I mean, you all have talked about how you leaned on them during a transition, but what should they be prepared for? Alexis, do you want to weigh in on that?
Yeah, I certainly do. I think it is so important, and I loved it when Valerie talked about the outreach that they did in the very beginning. It's important to remind them that they are public servants of the American people, that at the end of the day, that is who they serve, and that they have to reach deep into themselves to take pride in the work that they are doing, and to know that even if they aren't applauded or thanked, that they are making a difference. And you have to, put on that armor and be prepared to just continue to do your work. Continue to bloom where you are planted in whatever agency it is, and remind yourselves and your colleagues that you are making a difference on behalf of the American people.
I think that is very
And I
well
would
said.
say to understand what the principal, what the president wants to accomplish, and get smart and get strategic and get creative about how you help him achieve those objectives.
Just
One of
add
the
a
last
clear
Spirits.
priorities, because that's one of the hard things when you're first there is what's the priority? What do I need to do right now? And so sort of a clear sense of what needs to be done and when and what's most important, because there's so much coming at you. It's very hard to have that clarity.
Charlie, you want
And,
to
and,
add?
and Karen, I agree with that, but I think what I was responding to, if we don't have a clear outcome, it's going to be up to them to keep that focus. And if you're not getting that direction, that's very, very hard. And
Right.
And I think
so
we
I
also have
say
to
they
note
may have to go
that
internally.
I think they have been, frankly, beaten down a lot over the last nearly 4 years. And so
Yeah.
I think that if Vice President Biden wins, it's going to be incumbent upon him to lift them back up, validate the important role that he believes that they play, make it clear, where there have been changes in the norms, let's say, like an independent Justice Department, or relying on your scientists, or believing your intelligence communities, to just name three. That I think you have to be very intentional if you're if Vice President Biden, and how you go in and rehabilitate the important role that you believe they play. Because I can assure you that there are many who are feeling really pretty wounded over this last 4-year period.
Well, we've come to the end of our time. I want to thank everybody on this panel for some incredible insights and advice. Alexis, Herman, Valerie, Jarrett, Karen Hughes, Margaret Spellings, and I'm going to hand it back to Bill and Tolis, who's going to close it up for us.
Well, thank you, Amy. What a terrific panel that was. I think we've really in just about 3 hours have covered an enormous waterfront. And huge thanks to all of our panelists, who I will come back to. Let me go to some key takeaways, or at least what my notes are from the last great 3 hours. First, the hallmark of our system is the peaceful transfer of power. You don't want to play politics with that. We have one sitting president, and that president needs to sprint through the tape. The Constitution allows that, but also needs to show deference to the people's will. And that means helping the incoming president prepare if the sitting president is defeated. Even in the worst transition, Abraham Lincoln's, that's happened when 7 states seceded between Election Day and Inauguration Day. But there are also great examples of great handovers within a party, from Reagan to Bush 41, but really between parties. In that contested 2000 election, both then Vice President Gore's gracious consolation speech, but then also President Bush preparing well behind the scenes, and President-elect Bush being ready to take office. Also, we saw a terrific transfer in Bush 43 to Obama. President Bush knew, particularly from the searing experience of 9/11, how important it was to have a peaceful transfer in case there was an emergency. And there was an emergency at that moment, the 2008 financial crisis. My second takeaway is that there are 2 phases to a transition. There's the pre-election phase, when the incoming team is preparing itself. And that's while the election is going on. They need to work silently on personnel and policy planning, and they should stay away from the campaign. That makes it easier for both parts of the same team to do their job. But then after the election, the transition team needs to trust the planning and start to build real teams. That's going to be a big challenge this year. We heard that. COVID is not just a crisis, which will need to be addressed along with an economic crisis, hopefully not a political crisis. But then we also have the racial justice reckoning. But then COVID also presents real challenges, building a culture, as we all feel every day in our own workplace, how hard it is to work with one another. Here, you're building a brand new team, and doing that in a state of crisis is particularly going to be hard. And then there are additional challenges on that. Access to documents, access to not just having security clearances, but to secure operating facilities. We're not prepared for secure communications, and we will need to work that out in the transition period. Point 3 goes to building the team. Margaret Spellings referred to it as a symphony of players. Dennis McDonough talked about the importance of diversity in a team that looks like America. And both of those things are really important. The White House team is particularly critical. Getting that done first can be super helpful. But then it's also important to focus on the cabinet. And as we heard Mac McClarty say, having the cabinet done by Inauguration Day is a good benchmark, at least having selected those people, because they're going to have to go through confirmation hearings. The confirmations pose an increasing challenge because of politics with the confirmations. And perhaps that's something that the whole country in this moment of crisis can focus on doing well, to not deepen the discord, but to try to get beyond it. But then finally, also trusting the civil service in the cabinet agencies and even in the White House. The National Security Council staff are often civil servants or foreign service officers or military personnel. But there are a host of civil servants across the federal government who are prepared to help and who really pride themselves in preparing a president and the new cabinet to hit the ground running when they arrive. Takeaway 4 is prepare for the worst. And that really requires coordination between the incoming team and the outgoing team. We heard about national security challenges, including with the current and sitting administration thinking through what decisions they have to make and what ones can be deferred to the incoming president, and then coordinating with that president. That's challenging because of security clearances and other things, but it is something that previous transitions have done well, and something that should be able to happen even in the current pandemic. And the current pandemic proves the importance of this. Planning for pandemics. The next pandemic could be a very different one. We could have different transmission rates, infection rates, and also mortality rates. So if there was a different pandemic kicking off, how would the government respond differently if the circumstances were different? Some emergency efforts can be done with Congress as well during a transition period. That is, congressional response to emergencies, funding new activities, either in an economic crisis or the one that we're doing now. You may need to be negotiating those arrangements during the transition period, as is what happened in 2008 to 2009. And then finally, the fifth and most important one is look for opportunities to bring the country together. Going from campaigning to governing is a really difficult challenge. In Bush 43, particularly coming out of the contentious election, President-elect Bush immediately started reaching out to Senator Ted Kennedy. And that really set the mood and tone for a year of hard work that led to No Child Left Behind. President Clinton similarly started focusing with the outgoing administration and in the early months of his administration on passing what became NAFTA, which happened in President Clinton's first year. And after a rocky first 6 months of that administration, when a budget was finally approved, he turned to a bipartisan piece of legislation that helped bring the country back together. So I think that was my 5 takeaways. We look forward to hearing yours. Please be in touch with both us and our friends at the Partnership for Public Service. And now is my time to start thanking people. First, big thanks to all of our panelists. What a pleasure and a joy to have 5 former chiefs of staff, a former national security advisor, 3 former cabinet secretaries, 2 counselors to the president, 2 of the finest journalists in the country, Margaret Brennan and Amy Walter, heroes to not just me, but my 2 daughters, and my superstar colleagues, Melody Barnes and Barbara Perry. The Bush 41, Clinton, Bush 43, Obama, library foundations and centers, especially our partners, Jim McGrath, Stephanie Street, Brian Casaboom, and Michael Stroutmantis. Thank you for your partnership and friendship. And then Dave Marchuk, the director of the Center for Transition, at the Partnership for Public Service and my co-author now on this study of 10 transitions in crisis, which is available on the Miller Center website. We at the Miller Center want to thank the George and Judy Marcus and their Democracy Praxis Fund, which went into all of our work on this event. We couldn't do this great work without you and all of our supporters. And finally, thanks to all of you for watching this event and for playing the most important job in our democracy, that of an informed citizenry. So on behalf of all of my colleagues at the Miller Center who worked hard with the Center for Transition to pull this together, our big thanks to everyone.